Thumbs up.
Let me begin with a story. When I was a grade school student in Eastern Washington, I had a wonderful teacher. We only had 5 students in the class, but the teacher taught me to love Abraham Lincoln. And I got it in my favorite word, in my hooch. And I kept it there for a long, long time. And when I went to teach at the University of New Mexico, one of my beloved colleagues, a man by the name of Frank Saz, said to me, "Dick, you love Abraham Lincoln and you love the American West. Why not do books that bring those two subjects together?" I hadn't thought about that, but it became something that I really wanted to do. So as I'll show you here in a moment, the first one came out in 2010. It was a collection of essays by lots of people, and I had a long 100-page introduction, and this was really a kind of introduction to this subject. Now, when you think about it, there are somewhere between 16 and 17,000 books done on Abraham Lincoln, but only a half a dozen done on Abraham Lincoln and the American West. And if you think there are 60 to 70,000 books on the Civil War, almost none deal with Abraham Lincoln and the American West. So it was a kind of open field for me. So I got excited about it, and then went on to do this one because I'm from the Pacific Northwest. So I took Abraham Lincoln and tried to suggest how he impacted the Pacific Northwest. Well, then I got excited about the possibility of this because they were deciding on a series of books. Deidre's predecessor talked to me about the possibility of having a book done on each of the persons at Mount Rushmore. And would I do the Lincoln book? And of course, I very much was excited about that possibility. So it meant that I had then done quite a bit of stuff, but also I co-authored a book on the presidents of the American West with Glenda Riley, and we dealt with Abraham Lincoln and the West in that book also. So that meant there were quite a few. Now, the earlier views, when they did deal with Abraham Lincoln and the West, suggested that the Civil War was really a military history, and that far Westerners, because they were far removed, were sort of spectators. I want to change that point of view. Now, I don't want you to throw out that previous view. I want you to have the two views beside one another. I'm what you call a both-and thinker rather than an either-or. So Abraham Lincoln, yes, is very important for Southern and Northern history, but he's also important for East and West. And so that's what I've tried to do to add that ingredient. For example, this book by Josephia, wonderful military history, very much left Lincoln out of the story of what happened in the West. But I want to suggest to you that there is a new view that really the Civil War era and Lincoln was much more than a military history, and that the Westerners were much more than spectators. So if you really want to see a thesis or a theme, it's that Abraham Lincoln was very much involved with the American West. I would go as far as to say Abraham Lincoln was one of the founding fathers of the American West. And I'll do it by looking at these things. I'll look at Lincoln and politics, economics, slavery and emancipation, civil rights, Indian relations, North-South competitions, and then I'll end with what I think is the most magnificent idea about the American West, and I'll talk about it at the end of my presentation. Well, we start with Lincoln's relationships with his family. We don't have much in the way of pictures for them. This is his father, Thomas. And historians have said a great deal about Lincoln's relationships with his father. I don't go as far in negativity as other people. I would say that there was tension. Thomas Lincoln believed that you needed to be a farmer and a physical worker. And he thought that Abraham, his son, especially after they moved to Indiana, wasn't enough of that, and that he was spending too much time reading books, which didn't interest Thomas. But on the other hand, Lincoln had wonderful relationships with both of his mothers. His first mother, Nancy, his biological mother, died when he was 9 with a terrible sickness that occurred in Indiana. And then his stepmom came, and she was Sarah Bush Johnston, and she was a wonderful, supportive mother who brought in 3 of her own children and very much encouraged Abraham Lincoln with his reading. So he didn't get much encouragement as a thinker from his father, but he did from his two mothers. And so when he said, almost everything that I owe to my sacred mother, we don't know which of the mothers because both of them were so supportive. So starting out in Kentucky, moving then when he was about 9 years old, they went to Indiana, and he stayed there until he was about 21. Lincoln called himself later as a man of the West. And if you think about it, we don't geographically refer to that as the West now, but Lincoln did. And people then in the Tennessee and Kentucky saw it as the West and Illinois. So the three places that Lincoln lived were Western. So he saw himself as a man of the West. Well, if we look at his entrance into the world, he said he was going to do it on his own. And we see his first politics after he leaves at age 21. There was a kind of unwritten rule those days that if you were of that age, you supported your parents and you brought all your money back and you gave to your parents, which Lincoln did until he was 21. His family then had moved to Illinois, and he left the home and he went further west into what was called New Salem. Here's New Salem. It's about 20 miles up the river from Springfield, and he was there for a period of about 6 or 7 years. He did all kinds of things. He worked in a grocery store. He was something of a postmaster for a while. He was an engineer, and then he was encouraged to read law, and he began to do that. And he was there about 6 years, began his political career in the state legislature, and then moved to Springfield. And if you go to Springfield now, it'd be interesting to find out how many of you have been there. Here's where Lincoln's law office is, and right to the right out of this slide is where the government building is still there that Lincoln inhabited when he was a part of the Illinois legislature. So Lincoln, by his middle to late 20s, had moved in from New Salem to Springfield, and then there, after a period of time, met Mary, and they married. Mary had come from the South and came from a pro-slavery home, but in fact, one time said she was going to marry a man that became president of the United States. And she was very motivated, and she was very supportive of him and his political ambitions. They had 4 children. Tragically, only one, the oldest, Robert, really made it to full adulthood. They lost all of the others. It wasn't an unhappy marriage, but it was a marriage that had lots of challenges. But she was very supportive of Abraham Lincoln's political ambitions. So there are the boys. You can see there being Willie, the one that dies during, no, in fact, this is Willie. And down in the left-hand corner is Robert. And there's Eddie, who was named after Lincoln's friend, Edward Baker here in the West. And then the young man they called Tad or Tom. I don't know how many of you have been to the Lincoln House in Springfield. It's a wonderful sort of view. I admit to you that Abraham Lincoln, I think, is our greatest president. So it was sacred for me to see all those. I guess I've been to Springfield 3 or 4 times. It's a short walk, maybe about 15 minutes from this house to his law office in the center of Springfield. Well, of course, Lincoln was a Whig, and part of the Whig origins were their discontent with Andrew Jackson. And so in the early 1830s, they established themselves as separate from Andrew Jackson. They believed that he was too dictatorial, that he had taken too much power into his own hands. And they were saying, the Whigs were saying, that the power should be in the hands of Congress to make legislation. It would be the job of the president to administrate, to carry it out, not to bring legislation into existence, but to carry it out. So by time this occurs in 1858, his debates, Lincoln has been a legislator in Springfield and in previous small town in Illinois. But by 1858, he's very well known in Illinois. And there's even talk, and he thought about it, running for the Senate earlier. He hadn't done that well, but in 1858, the Republicans, which is a new political party, 1856, 2 years before this, was the first year that there was a Republican candidate for president. So think about that. Lincoln is a Whig from 1832 to the middle 1850s. Now think about that. He's only a Republican for about 10 years, the middle 1850s to his death in 1865. So he brings with him a lot of ideas from the Whigs, and I'll make that clear as we go along. Well, this certainly brought him on the scene, and many people so much liked Lincoln's speaking that they began to talk that he ought to be a person that they ought to be nominated for the presidency. Now, remember, the Republican Party is brand new. They don't have an awful lot of candidates like the Democrats who had been in existence for more than a half century. So Lincoln begins to think a lot about it, and he told some friends that maybe it was now beginning to eat on him, and he began to go around and to give talks. And one of the most favorite of his and famous of his speeches was what we call the Cooper Union speech, which is in New York City. And it's there where he gave this wonderful one-liner that I hope you can keep. He said, and this was February 1860, "Let us have faith that might makes right." And so what Lincoln believed, that is, if you become the strong president, make sure that you use the might you have to do right things. And he believed that some of the presidents of the past had not done that. Well, let's look now specifically at Lincoln and the American West with some of these subjects in politics and economics. Now, this map will show you what it looked like for Lincoln in the first part, in the left, on what states we're in, what territories we're in. And you can see how much of it is still territory and hasn't become states. And then on the right-hand side, you can see some of those areas like Montana and Idaho and Arizona have moved from unincorporated to new states. Now, here's the thing that many of us don't realize. Presidents of the United States in the 1860s had a great deal of power in dealing with territories. It wasn't well organized as far as the Constitution, but it had evolved so that presidents were very important, and they had a lot of power of determining, for example, naming the governors of these places. So this shows politically how much Lincoln could influence what was happening politically in the American West. And now I'm going to use several examples, and because I did a lot with the Pacific Northwest, my first examples are the Pacific Northwest. Anson Henry on the left was Lincoln's good buddy politically in Springfield, and then came to Oregon in the 1850s, stayed the rest of his life. And so what he did is he would write back to Lincoln and make suggestions, not only about leaders in Washington and Oregon, but also what he ought to do in the American West. The man in the middle, Simeon Francis, was the editor of the major newspaper in Springfield, and he came. And later, Lincoln will name him to an office in the state of Washington. So he was at one time the editor of the Oregonian, the most important newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. And probably the man on the right, Edward Baker, was probably the most influential and a very close friend of the Lincolns. They named their second son, Eddie, after Edward Baker, a wonderful orator. He came from England, and he came to California to run because he was ambitious, didn't make it there. And think of this, he comes to Oregon, and in 6 months, he is a candidate for the Senate and wins. So he becomes a senator from Oregon. And by the way, he introduces Lincoln to in his inaugural period. So there was a very strong connection there between Baker and Lincoln. So Lincoln then had an awful lot of influence in the Oregon country. If you look at Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, you see Isaac Ingalls Stevens was the Washington governor, and he was something of a Democrat, so it wasn't a person that Lincoln got along very well with. But by time Lincoln came in, Isaac Ingalls Stevens was already, those days you could be, after you were named by the president, you could then run for the territorial delegate, and that was elected by the territory rather than by the territory. So he became the territorial delegate and then lost his life in the Civil War. This gentleman was very much a better leader. This was William H. Wallace, and he was both governor of Washington and in Idaho. And within months after he's named to both of those, Lincoln naming him, he becomes the territorial delegate. Now, here's an example of a person that gets along well with Lincoln because he's anti-slavery, but he's not an abolitionist. So Lincoln is making best connections politically in the West with people that are like that. Then this crazy guy, Caleb Lyon, who went around to all the miners in Idaho and tried to teach them the Greek classics, and it don't work. And eventually he left the state, probably Lincoln's maybe worst candidate that he named. And he left, and the rumors were that he had something like 50 to 100,000 of money in his pocket. Or Sidney Edgerton, who was in Montana, something of an abolitionist, and Lincoln couldn't work that well with him. In California, Baker, his friend, tried to run, and they were trying to send bad stuff, and Lincoln wouldn't allow that and burned the stuff. So he's very supportive of people that were his supporters. An interesting connection with the Mormons. Brigham Young and the Mormons didn't like Lincoln because the Mormons wanted to make their own governor, and that would be Brigham Young because he's the president of the Mormons. And Lincoln doesn't want to name him because he wants to have a leader who's not tied to a specific religious group. So for a while, there was a lot of tension between Brigham Young and Lincoln, but it went away by the end of the Civil War. So that was an interesting transition in the American West. So to see that map again, you see the influence politically of Lincoln moving from these being territories on the left to states and more territories on the right. So in that 4 years that Lincoln was in the White House, he moved quite a bit of the West from unterritorial to territorial and some to state. For example, Nevada is unterritorial. When Lincoln becomes president, it becomes a territory and it even becomes a state. So it makes that move in less than 4 years. Some people argue that he wanted to push him so that he would get support for the Emancipation Proclamation. Maybe, but probably not. So I've written an essay that appeared in Montana Magazine, and I call him the political founding father, Abraham Lincoln of the American West. And so that is an example of something that I really believe, that if you look at what he did in those territories, he was something of a founding father in the West. But let's look at his economic influences. And this is amazing to me. This all happens in 1862 in a period from about April to about July of 1862. And if you think about these three, the Pacific Railroad Act, the Homestead Act, and the Land Grant College Act, they all happen and they are passed by Congress. Remember, Lincoln is a Whig-like in his background, even though he's become a Republican president. He wants Congress to pass those, but he makes very clear that he's supportive of it before they pass, and very soon he signs. Now, think of chronology. This is April to about June or July of 1862. What happens in September? The Emancipation Proclamation. So what you have here is West stuff happening as he's on his steps, on his way to doing the Emancipation Proclamation. So we think about the importance of these connections. He wanted to connect the West. Remember, California had become a state in 1850. So they wanted to, and Oregon had become a state in 1859. So he wanted to make sure that things east of the Mississippi were connected to the West. So for him, railroads were very, very important. By the way, he'd been a railroad lawyer with the Illinois Central, so he had a lot of railroad experience. He's very supportive of the railroads. Now, the artists give you a feeling that if you look at the Homestead Act, this is what it looked like. But if you really see some views, it's a little bit more outbacks in when you think about it. But he wanted the land to get 160 acres. The man could get 150, 60 acres, 160 acres if he stayed 5 years and developed, and this would be enough, the house behind there. And his wife could get 160 acres. So there could be 320 acres. He wanted veterans and other people, and he himself was ambitious for the Lincoln family to go west. So he was very supportive of that. And then there was his development of the land grant colleges. And this was very important. Every state, now I didn't say territory, every state could get 30,000 acres for every member from the state in Congress. So that meant every state could get 90,000 acres because everyone had at least 2 senators and 1 congressperson. But the 90,000 acres could come from any state. So that meant that if people in Massachusetts, if they didn't think that the lands were in Massachusetts what they wanted, they could pick them from California. So Westerners were a little bit gun shy of this, but it certainly went through. And in Dakotas, you had some land grant institutions. All right, how about slavery and emancipation? When Lincoln was in Congress from 47 to 49, he supported the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso said, if we gain any land for Mexico in winning the Mexican-American War, we will not allow slavery in it. Lincoln was for that. It didn't pass, but nonetheless, Lincoln said that. And then he, of course, began to support the Emancipation Proclamation. First revision of it in September 62, finished in January of 1863. Now, think of number 3 here. We have a tendency to think that slavery is the most important for bringing about civil war. I agree. But put together the West and slavery, because part and maybe at the center, the 2 political parties were arguing about what would be the future of slavery in the American West. So if you put together the West and slavery, I think you see the most important conflict that led to the Civil War. So here you see Lincoln with his presidency. I always think that Doris Kearns Goodwin has done about as good a book as you can for the team of rivals, in which she talks about this, in which Lincoln, this shows his ability to work with people. He takes his rivals and brings them into his cabinet. Now, here's something that's developing during his time. See the word miscegenation at the bottom. That was a new word. And what you see here is the artist negatively portraying white men and black women, or miscegenation coming for that union. And that was a negative thing that many people believed about it. Now, I think Abraham Lincoln's our greatest president, but think about it this way. Abraham Lincoln was no angel. He was no saint. By our definition, Abraham Lincoln was a racist. What I mean by that is he did not believe all black people and all white people were equal in all respects. He did believe some equality, and eventually he was moving toward rights for everybody. But he was not a person who accepted everything. So that when you think about it, he didn't talk about miscegenation, but he didn't want total equality either. Well, in the area of civil rights, he sometimes used the suspension of habeas corpus. What we mean is trial by courts, because he believed that sometimes we shouldn't do that. So he would, when somebody was against his policies, he sometimes would suspend habeas corpus, or he would suspend newspapers that in fact were very anti-Northern. And sometimes a politician from Ohio, in his freedom of speech, Lincoln made sure that he was sort of sent out of state. And Vallandigham went to the South and got into a boat and went to Canada and ran for the governor of Ohio. And Lincoln just sort of stayed off the scene. But these are examples of where Lincoln could push for taking the rights away from people if they were anti-North. One of the most important writers in the American West during this time was a writer in Oregon by the name of Joaquin Miller. Joaquin Miller was in Eugene, Oregon, where the University of Oregon is, and his parents were all pro-North, but he was pro-Confederate. So you could see there would be some support for the Confederacy in parts of the West. Now, this is a place where I would give maybe Lincoln his least strong votes. He believed in reservations, concentrations they were called. He didn't pay much attention to treaties. So if treaties were made, he just passed them on to the Senate. He believed that we ought to Christianize Native Americans. Now, he promised that he was going to reform Indian policy. He didn't get it done. And I would suggest to you that when you look at his agenda day by day, when there would be 20 or 30 telegrams every day dealing with military things, he didn't have time to do everything, but he didn't move ahead to help with Indians. So think about these contexts: the Minnesota Sioux Uprising, Chief John Ross, Indian visits, Bear River, Sand Creek. I'll move fast through those, but you'll see this famous thing that had impact on the Dakotas in 1862, in which Indians came back and tried to take their lands, and they were taken by the military. And Little Crow, their leader, brought them back, hoping to get more rights. And then there was this famous hanging that occurred December 26th in 1862. And I always ask my students, and it would be interesting to ask some of you the same way. 303 people were accused of capital crimes, murder and rape. Only 38 were hanged. All the rest were freed, although some were imprisoned. I always ask my students, what's the most important? The 37 or 38 that lost their lives, or the 230 some, 260 some that saved their lives? Almost always my students said the horrendous hanging was the worst of the two. Well, he promised John Ross that he would help him. John Ross went to Washington, D.C., but he didn't. And there was this famous Sand Creek massacre, which occurred in the end of Lincoln's presidency. He promised to find out what had happened. He did not. When the Indians went to visit, Lincoln wasn't very good and knowledgeable about Indian relationships. Well, about his military policies. Here are the things he wanted to establish. He wanted to clear the Mississippi. He wanted to divide the Confederacy, that is, at the Mississippi River, and he wanted to protect California. So he wanted to make sure that the West was still in the Union, and he didn't want the South to move completely to the West Coast. So these were some of the Lincoln meetings that were supportive of his policies in the West. But some, especially mining areas, this one in Southern Oregon, and many of them were Democratic areas. So they didn't support Lincoln's policies, and they certainly were not anti-slavery. And see this artist's presentation of trying to suggest what it was like in the South when the emancipation came. They're going to shoot him and they're going to stab him. Look at all the hair. And that's, of course, hyperbole, but it's suggesting hyperbole about how the South reacted. And then, of course, comes tragedy at Ford Theater. And as Deidre is pointing out, tomorrow, the 14th of 1865. And of course, we know that we have a gentleman who we certainly don't want to talk much about, but John Wilkes Booth took the life of Lincoln. Now, this last part is having to do with, all right, now Lincoln is gone. He's built the West, but how do you memorialize him? How do you celebrate Lincoln? And I want to suggest to you that one of the ways that Lincoln will be celebrated is by what happens at Mount Rushmore. But that doesn't happen easily. People have to make some decisions about what is going to happen. So that right after Lincoln's death, there were some movements to what do you do to memorialize? Where should it be? And there was some talk about Washington, D.C., because it ought to be where the Washington, D.C. was. But the first one that went up was in Springfield, and there was an argument even in Springfield. The town leaders wanted to put it downtown because then that would draw tourists to downtown. Mary Lincoln did not want that. She wanted it out in a nearby cemetery, and that's where it ended up. It's a magnificent memorial. I've been here twice, and it's very much a salute. And these are the people that supported Lincoln in the memorial. Well, then the one probably that we know most about, of course, is the one that appeared in Washington, D.C. And if you've been inside, there's a huge statue of Lincoln. And this is, in a way, attempt to marry Lincoln, the Westerner, in what I'm portraying here, and the celebration of sort of the ancient tradition, the sort of founding fathers tradition of going all the way back to Greece and Rome. And there was quite a bit of reaction to that. Some people loved this artistic rendition of this, but they wondered, if you put Lincoln in this, did you really take him away from his background? He was a man of the West. He was a man who built fences. He was a man who did an awful lot of the outbacks. He did a lot for the West. So there was controversy and disagreement about this. Well, then a man in South Dakota, if you don't know anything about Doane Robinson, you should. He got all excited as a historian and tourist, a man who wanted to build on tourism, and he thought he ought to do something to build sort of monuments. He'd heard that they were doing this in the South, that a man was doing Southern stuff. So he began to be excited about it, but he got turned down by some people. And then he went on with that idea. And one of the things that came to him is that, in fact, we could maybe change this. It's now called Black Elk Peak. A map that I have the wrong name on it, but this is what Mount Rushmore looked like before the president heads up here. And you can see on this map two things that I need to update. That in fact, the biggest controversy that deals with Mount Rushmore now is having to do with native rights and whether what's happened here has taken away from native rights. And so that's one of the reasons why it's been changed from Harney Peak to Black Elk Peak, and that this is not now just the Black Hills National Forest. It's become the Black Hills National Forest rather than just the National Forest down here as it is down here. So this is what happens in the period of sort of memorializing it. Let me say some very quick things about how Mount Rushmore memorializes. This is the key figure. John Gutzon de la Mothe Borglum was a man of LDS polygamy background, born in the very southern tip of Idaho, self-trained artist, moved around the West, California, went to Europe, self-trained and began to make a name for himself. He was a man who believed very strongly in myself and do it my way. On the other hand, he was a very talented sculptor. Put those two together. Remember I said to you that I'm a both and. Put together the difficulty of working with him personally and put it together with his talents. And both of those are true. And he became very interested in Abraham Lincoln. In fact, he named his own son Abraham, or Lincoln, actually. And he started in 1925, the Lincoln Memorial. It was finished about 1941, not completely finished. And Lincoln, his son, did some of the finishing. Borglum himself died about that time. So son Lincoln had to do the finishing. And I find it interesting to look at the things that Borglum did to try to memorialize Lincoln. You see here the face. It's something like 14 feet from down here up to here. And look very carefully at the eyes. One of the things that Borglum wanted to do, and he believed that almost always Lincoln wanted to show the right side more than the left side because he thought it was a stronger side. But here, if you looked at the eyes, he put a kind of block in there so that when you saw the eyes from a distance, you didn't see a kind of blank there. You saw this little square that gave it life. So he wanted really to give an awful lot of life. And so you can see, if you looked at it, see, it looks like it's got quite a bit of life to it. So here's the sort of sculpturing that we see. Now, my last idea, the greater reconstruction. If you've been following me and you have been following the idea that Lincoln and the West is a very important partnership, you are well on your way to what I call the greater reconstruction. And it's an idea that's developed by Elliott West. I believe Elliott West is our most important Western historian, up front, even over some of the new Western historians. The greater reconstruction is this. Elliott West believed that we too often separated what was happening between, say, the 1830s and the 1870s. So the rise of slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction, sort of Western, Eastern, and dealing with North-South, and what was happening in the West. He said we ought to see those together. They ought to be in the same chapter, that we ought to see the connection. The greater reconstruction is to put together the East and the West. So the reconstruction in our history is to put together the East and the West. And that would be the goal of what we ought to do for history. I have here, in 2002, he gave his presidential address before the Western history, and it was published here. And that was sort of the first time that he did the greater reconstruction. And then he did a monograph on the last Indian War, the Nez Perce story, in 2009. And he has a brand new book that just came out in February. And I don't have a slide here, but let me give you the name. It's called The Continental Reckoning, Reckoning, The Continental Reckoning. I will tell you this, I believe it's going to win a Pulitzer. And at the center of it is this idea of the greater reconstruction. I think that if you want to understand Abraham Lincoln in the West and in the Civil War era, and if you do that, long old Abraham will be with us a bit longer. Thank you very much.